November 1942, Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands. Asterisk, asterisk, the jungle breathed with humidity, so thick it felt like drowning on land. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto crouched in a captured American foxhole on the northern perimeter of Henderson Field. His rifle across his knees, his stomach a hollow vessel that had forgotten the sensation of fullness. The earth beneath him was still warm from the previous occupant's body heat. Around him was a stench of rotting vegetation mixed with cordite and death smell. That had become the constant companion of every man fighting in this green hell. He reached down to adjust his position, and his fingers brushed against something foreign. Something that crinkled with a sound so out of place in this landscape of mud and blood that it froze him in place. Paper. Clean paper. He lifted it into the fading afternoon light filtering through the canopy, and his hands began to tremble. It was a ration box. Olive drab, unmarked except for the English letters he could barely decipher. U.S. Army Field Ration K. The box felt impossibly solid in his hands. Heavier than it should be for something made of cardboard. For 3 weeks, Yamamoto had subsisted on half portions of rice mixed with barley, occasionally supplemented by whatever could be foraged from the jungle grubs, roots leaves that left his mouth bitter for hours. The Imperial Japanese Army had promised them victory, had promised them glory, had promised them that the will of the warrior would overcome all material disadvantage. They had not promised them food. In the 17 days since his unit had made their desperate night march to reinforce the Guadalcanal garrison, Yamamoto had watched his rations dwindle from inadequate to nearly non-existent. Supply lines were severed. Ships couldn't reach them. The Americans controlled the sea and the sky, and now in his hands. He held the evidence of a truth so devastating it threatened to crack the foundations of everything he'd been taught to believe. He tore open the box with fingers that shook from more than just hunger. Inside, nested with an almost absurd precision, were items wrapped in wax paper and cellophane. A can of meat, biscuits in a sealed packet, lemon powder, cigarettes, 4 of them, perfectly formed, dry, untouched by the jungle's moisture, chewing gum, sugar tablets, and there, wrapped in brown paper with a silver foil interior, something he recognized from peacetime, from the luxuries of Tokyo before the war. Chocolate. American chocolate. He lifted it to his nose and inhaled a scent that belonged to another world. A world where men did not die for lack of vitamins. Where supply chains functioned with mechanical efficiency. Where the economy producing these goods hummed with such overwhelming power that it could afford to give its soldiers candy in a war zone. Yamamoto looked around at his fellow soldiers. Skeletal figures in uniforms that hung loose on frames that grew thinner each day. Lieutenant Sato had ordered them to hold this position, to prepare for another banzai charge that would redeem their honor and drive the Americans into the sea. But Yamamoto, sitting in that foxhole with an American ration box in his lap, felt something shift inside him, not his loyalty, not yet, but his certainty. The chocolate bar in his hand weighed perhaps 2 ounces. It represented an industrial capacity, a logistical sophistication, an abundance so vast and so casual that it packed candy into combat rations. As darkness fell over Guadalcanal and the sounds of artillery began their nightly conversation across no man's land, Takeshi Yamamoto broke off a piece of that chocolate and placed it on his tongue, and tasted the future. To understand the profound psychological impact of American field rations on Japanese soldiers during the Pacific War, one must first comprehend the vast chasm that separated the two nations not merely in military philosophy, but in fundamental assumptions about the relationship between warfare, economy, and the individual soldier's worth. The Japanese military tradition, forged over centuries and hardened in the fires of Bushido culture, emphasized spiritual strength over material comfort. The warrior's honor lay in his ability to endure hardship, to transform suffering into virtue, to make deprivation itself a weapon against the soft, decadent enemy who could not match his discipline and resolve. This was not mere propaganda. It was woven into the very fabric of military training and strategic planning. Japanese soldiers were conditioned to expect hardship as the natural state of warfare, to view adequate rations as a luxury rather than a right, and to believe that their superior morale would overcome any advantage in equipment or supply. The Imperial Japanese Army's logistics system reflected this philosophy. Brutal clarity. While Japanese military planners excelled at tactical innovation and operational audacity, they consistently underestimated or simply dismissed the importance of sustaining their forces in the field. Supply lines were treated as secondary concerns, afterthoughts to be addressed once the decisive battle had been won. The standard Japanese field ration, when it was available at all, consisted primarily of rice, sometimes accompanied by pickled vegetables, dried fish, or miso paste, but often reduced to bare grain that soldiers had to cook themselves, under battlefield conditions that made fire building a potentially fatal activity. A Japanese soldier's daily ration, when full strength, provided approximately 2,000 calories. By comparison, the American ration alone provided nearly 3,000 calories, supplemented by additional rations, D-rations, and hot meals when conditions permitted. But the disparity was not merely quantitative. It was qualitative, philosophical, symbolic. The Americans, building upon lessons learned in the First World War and driven by a fundamentally different conception of the citizen soldier's place in society, had invested enormous resources into the science of military nutrition. The Quartermaster Corps, working with food scientists, nutritionists, industrial designers, and soldiers themselves, had developed a system of field feeding that was revolutionary in its sophistication. The ration, introduced in 1942 and named after physiologist Ancel Keys, who designed it, was a complete survival package designed to sustain a soldier for one day of combat operations. Each unit came in 3 meals: breakfast, dinner, and Sopran contained not just calories, but carefully balanced proteins, vitamins, minerals, and yes, morale-boosting luxuries like chocolate, cigarettes, and instant coffee. The chocolate was specially formulated to resist melting in tropical heat. The cigarettes were sealed against moisture. The coffee could be prepared with cold water if necessary. Every element spoke to an assumption so fundamental that most Americans took it for granted that their soldiers were valuable, that their comfort mattered, that maintaining their physical and psychological well-being was not weakness, but essential military efficiency. When Japanese forces first encountered these rations in abandoned positions, captured supply dumps, or stripped from American prisoners and dead, the cognitive dissonance was profound and disorienting. Soldiers who had been taught that the enemy was soft, decadent, morally inferior, suddenly held in their hands evidence of an industrial and organizational capacity that dwarfed their own. The rations became more than food. They became artifacts from an incomprehensible civilization. Proof of a wealth so vast and so casually deployed that it could afford to give every front line soldier not just sustenance but comfort. Japanese war diaries and captured documents from the Pacific Theater are filled with stunned observations about American supplies. "They have so much that they throw away more than we receive," wrote one officer on New Guinea. "Their soldiers eat better in the jungle than we ate in garrison," noted another after examining captured stores on Saipan. But it was the specific items, the chocolate, the cigarettes, the coffee, that carried the heaviest psychological weight, because these were not necessities, but indulgences. Proof that America was fighting this war not from a position of desperate necessity, but from a foundation of overwhelming abundance. They came to the Pacific with songs on their lips and steel in their hearts, these soldiers of the Emperor, convinced that their sacrifice and purity of purpose would sweep aside the numerically superior but spiritually hollow Americans. The propaganda had been thorough and persuasive. In barracks from Kyushu to Hokkaido, in training camps where recruits were beaten into warriors, the message was consistent. The Americans were individualistic, comfort-seeking, unable to withstand hardship or accept the necessary sacrifices of total war. They would break when confronted with true Japanese fighting spirit. Their society, built on materialism and self-indulgence, produced soldiers who required elaborate supply systems and constant reinforcement because they lacked the inner strength to persevere through deprivation. Victory would come not through matching the enemy's industrial output impossibility. The Japanese strategic planners understood Even as they launched their war but through moral and spiritual superiority, that would compensate for material disadvantage. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, landing on Guadalcanal in October 1942 as part of the reinforcements sent to retake Henderson Field, carried these assumptions in his mind as surely as he carried his Arisaka rifle. He had been told that American soldiers would flee when faced with night attacks, that they could not fight without their overwhelming firepower, that they crumbled when cut off from their supply lines. He had been told that the war would be won by warriors willing to charge into death, while the Americans would always retreat to preserve their comfortable lives. In the troopship crossing from Rabaul, packed into holds with hundreds of other men, eating cold rice and singing songs of glory, Tanaka and his comrades had envisioned a battle in which their courage would prove decisive, in which the spiritual strength of Japan would triumph over American steel. The reality of Guadalcanal destroyed these illusions with surgical precision. The Americans did not flee from night attacks. They illuminated the jungle with flares and cut down bonsai charges with interlocking fields of machine gun fire. They did not crumble when engaged. They held positions with a stubborn tenacity that matched and often exceeded Japanese determination, and far from being severed from their supplies. They received a constant stream of reinforcements, ammunition, food, and equipment that made their positions stronger with each passing day, while Japanese forces withered on the vine. Within 2 weeks of arriving, Tanaka's unit had been reduced by combat casualties, disease, and starvation to roughly half its original strength. Men developed beriberi from vitamin deficiency. Tropical ulcers ate away at flesh. Dysentery weakened soldiers until they could barely stand. And through it all, across the perimeter, they could smell the Americans cooking their evening rations, could hear the sounds of a well-fed army settling in for the night. It was during a night patrol, crawling through the jungle toward the American lines with orders to probe for weaknesses, that Tanaka first encountered the ration dump. His squad had been moving in silence for hours, navigating by moonlight, filtering through the canopy, when they stumbled upon what appeared to be a supply position hastily abandoned during a skirmish earlier that day. Boxes were stacked under camouflage netting, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps. More food in one place than Tanaka had seen since leaving Japan. His sergeant, a veteran of China, made a quick decision. They would take what they could carry and return to Japanese lines before dawn. What followed was less a military operation than a desperate scramble. Soldiers stuffing their packs and pockets with American rations, gorging themselves on the spot. Weeping with relief and rage at the abundance spread before them, Tanaka opened a ration can labeled meat and beans and ate directly from the tin with his fingers, not bothering with the provided utensil. The taste was foreign, heavily salted and spiced in ways unfamiliar to his palate. But it was protein and fat and calories, things his body craved with an urgency that transcended culture. He found cigarettes Lucky Strikes, Chesterfields, Camel's American brands he'd seen in magazines before the war. When such luxuries were available in Tokyo shops for those who could afford them, he lit one with trembling hands and drew the smoke deep into his lungs. And for a moment the war receded, and he was simply a young man enjoying a cigarette. But it was the coffee that broke something fundamental in his understanding of the war. Not just coffee beans that would need to be roasted and ground, but instant coffee, powder that dissolved in hot or even cold water. Packaged in individual portions with sugar and powdered cream included, the Americans had industrialized and perfected even this small comfort, had made it so simple and efficient that every soldier could have fresh coffee on the front lines without any more effort than mixing powder in a canteen cup, as Tanaka and his squad made their way back through the jungle. Packs heavy with stolen rations, the weight they carried was more than physical. These men, raised in a culture that prized frugality and disdained excess, that found virtue in scarcity and honor in self-denial, now possessed evidence that their enemy operated from assumptions so alien that they seemed to come from another planet. The Americans assumed abundance. They assumed that soldiers deserved comfort. They assumed that maintaining morale through material means was not moral weakness, but practical wisdom. And most devastating of all, they had the industrial capacity to act on these assumptions. to produce and distribute these supplies across thousands of miles of ocean to every island and atoll where American forces fought, with a consistency and reliability that made the Japanese supply system look like a cruel joke. The historical record documents the psychological impact of this disparity with clinical precision. Though the human stories behind the statistics carry their own terrible weight, medical records from Japanese forces in the Pacific show malnutrition rates that would be shocking in any context but become almost incomprehensible when viewed against the backdrop of a nation at war. By late 1943, the average Japanese soldier in the South Pacific had lost between 20 and 30% of his body weight. Disease rates soared not primarily because of enemy action, but because men weakened. By chronic hunger had no immune reserves to fight tropical infections. Beriberi, disease of thiamine deficiency that had been virtually eliminated from Japanese society by the 1930s, returned with a vengeance in the military, causing nerve damage, heart failure, and death. Units would report their effective fighting strength not by counting casualties, but by tallying how many men could still walk without assistance. Captured Japanese documents reveal a supply situation that ranged from inadequate to catastrophic. On Guadalcanal, where the United States maintained naval and air superiority, Japanese supply runs, nicknamed the Tokyo Express by Americans, could deliver only a fraction of what the garrison needed, and often delivered nothing at all. Soldiers were ordered to forage from the jungle, to eat roots and grubs and whatever could be scavenged from the dense vegetation that surrounded them. Some units resorted to stripping bark from trees and boiling it into a thin gruel that provided bulk if not nutrition. Commanders issued orders reducing rations to 1/3 portions, then to 1/5, then to whatever could be found. War diaries from the period make for grim reading. The 15th of November, a ration shortage critical, men too weak to carry out offensive operations. The 22nd of November, no rations received, foraging parties sent out. The 29th of November, 8 men died today, malnutrition and disease. Combat strength now 40% of original. Woven through these clinical reports are observations about the enemy that take on an almost dreamlike quality. As if the writers cannot quite believe what they are witnessing. The Americans receive fresh supplies daily. They seem to lack nothing. Their soldiers are well fed and strong. We cannot understand how they maintain such abundance in this place where we starve. The contrast was not lost on American intelligence officers, who interrogated Japanese prisoners and studied. Captured diaries with growing understanding of the psychological advantage that superior logistics provided. A report from the Guadalcanal campaign noted, enemy prisoners consistently express astonishment at the quality and quantity of American rations. Many report that they believed American propaganda about our industrial capacity was exaggeration, till they saw our supplies with their own eyes. The abundance of small, luxury items, candy, cigarettes, coffee, seems to have particular impact, as these represent not necessity but surplus, proof of economic power beyond their previous conception. Another report from operations in New Guinea observed Japanese soldiers captured near abandoned. American positions were often found to have been carrying looted ration items. One prisoner had a dozen chocolate bars hidden in his uniform. When questioned, he stated he was saving them to prove to my family that such things existed. Oh, they would believe what we faced. The chocolate, in particular, took on symbolic significance that transcended its nutritional value. American chocolate bars issued to troops came in several varieties. The DeRation chocolate bar, a high-calorie emergency ration formulated to resist melting and sustain life in extreme conditions, and the more palatable chocolate included in rations and other meal packages. To American soldiers, these were comfort items, small luxuries that made the misery of combat marginally more bearable. To Japanese soldiers encountering them, they were proof of a civilization that could afford to fight its wars without demanding total sacrifice from its citizens. Chocolate was not a wartime necessity. It was a peacetime pleasure. The fact that America included it in combat rations suggested reserves of wealth, so deep that they could indulge their soldiers even as they deployed them to the far corners of the earth. Japanese soldiers would write home in letters that were intercepted and translated by Allied intelligence about the American chocolate, describing it with a mixture of envy and incomprehension. One such letter, captured on Saipan, read, "We face an enemy who gives his soldiers candy in the jungle. How can we win against such wealth? Our generals tell us that spirit will overcome material, but I have seen what their material can do, and I no longer know what to believe." The cigarettes carried their own weight of meaning. Tobacco was rationed in Japan itself by 1943, with civilians receiving bare allotments and soldiers getting somewhat better provision, but never enough. The sight of American rations containing 4 or 5 cigarettes per meal, premium brands, fresh and properly sealed against moisture, communicated volumes about relative industrial capacity. Japanese soldiers who smoked tanned, most did, as tobacco was one of the few available comforts in military life, would carefully preserve captured American cigarettes, rationing them with far more care than the Americans who had received them originally. The taste was different, the tobacco blends unfamiliar, but the psychological impact was profound. These cigarettes represented not just comfort, but surplus. The ability to allocate scarce resources to morale building rather than bare survival. They suggested an economy operating with margins so wide that it could afford to package individual portions of tobacco for single soldiers, rather than requiring men to share communal supplies and the coffee instant coffee. An American innovation that had been refined and perfected in the years before the war, represented perhaps the most damning evidence of all. The Japanese military provided tea when it provided anything in the form of leaves that needed to be brewed properly to be palatable. The Americans provided coffee that could be made in seconds with nothing but water and a cup. It came with its own sugar and cream that delivered caffeine and comfort with industrial efficiency. 2 soldiers accustomed to complex rituals around even the simplest forms of sustenance, this casualization of comfort was both seductive and threatening. It suggested a society that had mechanized and systematized even the smallest details of human need, that approached logistics with the same innovative spirit that produced their tanks and planes and ships. Japanese veterans interviewed decades after the war would often mention the coffee specifically, describing it as the moment when they understood the true scope of what they faced. "We knew they had more ships, more planes, more tanks," one veteran recalled. "But when I made coffee from powder in a cold canteen cup, in a foxhole on Peleliu, I understood that they had more of everything, down to the smallest detail, and that we could never match that abundance." The transformation in consciousness occurred, not in a single moment, but through an accumulation of encounters that eroded certainty like water wearing away stone. Sergeant Kenji Yoshida, a veteran of the China campaigns who had believed absolutely in Japanese superiority, found his faith tested daily as his unit held positions on Bougainville in early 1944. They had been cut off from supplies for 3 weeks, subsisting on whatever could be foraged when they overran an American patrol base in a rare successful attack. The Americans had retreated in good order, but they had left behind supplies that Yoshida's men fell upon with the desperation of starving animals. What they found was more than food. It was a catalog of American industrial philosophy rendered in cardboard and tin. There were rations, of course more varieties than Yoshida had imagined possible. K rations, C rations, D rations, each designed for specific circumstances and durations. There were 10-in-1 rations, group packages meant to feed 10 men for 1 day, containing not just calories but variety canned fruit, condensed milk, hard candy, jam, peanut butter. There were accessory packets with matches, cigarettes, toilet paper, can openers, chewing gum. There was medical supplies and individual first aid kits that every American soldier carried, more comprehensive than what was available in most Japanese aid stations. But it was what Yoshida thought of as the unnecessary necessities that troubled him most deeply, the items that served no direct military purpose, but revealed assumptions about what soldiers deserved. Playing cards, paperback books, writing paper in envelopes already stamped for mail, toothbrushes and toothpaste, foot powder, insect repellent, sunscreen. The Americans, Yoshida realized as he examined this treasure trove, were fighting the war as if they expected their soldiers to remain civilized human beings rather than being transformed entirely into weapons. They provided for comfort, for morale, for maintaining a connection to peacetime normalcy even in combat zones. The Japanese military philosophy held that such concerns were weakness. The soldier must be stripped of civilian comforts to become an effective warrior. But here was evidence that the Americans believed the opposite, that a soldier who was comfortable, well-fed, and felt valued would fight more effectively than one who was deliberately hardened through deprivation. And most troubling of all, the evidence suggested they were right. The Americans Yoshida had fought showed no signs of moral weakness, despite their material abundance. They fought with determination, held positions stubbornly, and demonstrated tactical competence that matched Japanese training. Their abundance had not made them soft. It had made them stronger. Yoshida took a chocolate bar from the supplies, a Hershey's bar in its distinctive brown wrapper, and sat down on a captured ammunition crate to eat it slowly. He tried to calculate what it represented in terms of industrial capacity, shipping tonnage, logistical planning. This chocolate had been manufactured in America, probably Pennsylvania, then transported across an entire continent to a port, loaded onto a ship, carried across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, unloaded at a forward base, transferred to a supply vessel, brought to Bougainville, and distributed to a patrol that had carried it into the jungle as casually as they carried their rifles. The supply chain required to make this possible, the shipping, the refrigeration, the organization, the absolute control of sea lanes was so far beyond Japanese capability that contemplating it induced a kind of vertigo. And this was just chocolate, a luxury item. One small element in a system that provided everything from artillery shells to toothpaste with the same mechanical efficiency around him. Yoshida's men were gorging themselves on American rations, eating with the single-minded intensity of the truly starved. He wanted to tell them to slow down, to save some for later, but he knew it was useless. They would eat until the supplies were gone because they had learned through bitter experience that tomorrow's rations were never guaranteed. The Americans could afford to be moderate because they knew more was coming. The Japanese had to seize every calorie when the opportunity presented because the next meal might be days away. This difference, Yoshida thought, was the war in miniature, one side operating from abundance, planning for the future, confident in their supply lines. The other side living meal to meal, scavenging, making do, knowing that the gap between them and the enemy grew wider with each passing day. He finished the chocolate and carefully folded the wrapper, placing it in his pocket. He would keep it, he decided, as evidence. Evidence of what? He wasn't entirely sure yet. Evidence that they were losing, certainly. Evidence that the promises made to them about American decadence had been lies, probably. Evidence that the war could not be won through spiritual strength alone, definitely. But also evidence that there existed in the world a civilization, capable of producing such abundance that it could give its soldiers candy in war zones, and that this abundance was not a sign of moral weakness, but of overwhelming strength. The wrapper crinkled in his pocket as he stood and began organizing his men to move out before American forces counterattacked. It would stay there, a small piece of brown paper and foil, through the battles to come, through the eventual retreat from Bougainville, through his capture on Okinawa in 1945, after the war, in a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines. He would show it to other Japanese soldiers and use it as a teaching tool. A small artifact that explained why they had lost. "This is why we failed," he would say, holding up the crumpled wrapper. "Not because we lacked courage, but because we faced an enemy who could afford to give their soldiers chocolate." The symbolic weight of these items, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, grew heavier as the war progressed, and the Japanese supply situation deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. By 1944, garrisons throughout the Pacific were essentially cut off, isolated on islands that had become prisons rather than fortresses. The American submarine campaign had devastated Japanese merchant shipping, reducing the flow of supplies to a trickle. Air superiority meant that even attempts to reach isolated garrisons by fast destroyer runs or submarine delivery were rarely successful. Men were ordered to grow their own food, to become self-sufficient, to live off the land. Some islands, like the Philippines, with its substantial civilian population and agricultural base, could partially support their garrisons. Others, like the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, offered almost nothing that could sustain human life. Soldiers on Tarawawik Island, Kwilene existed in states of progressive starvation, watching their strength ebb as they waited for the American assault that would end their suffering one way or another. In these conditions, captured American rations became currency, status symbols, sources of bitter conflict. Japanese military discipline, normally rigid to the point of brutality, sometimes broke down entirely when rations were discovered. There are documented cases of soldiers fighting over captured chocolate bars, of officers confiscating American supplies for their own use while enlisted men starved, of men so desperate for the vitamins and captured rations that they ate items that made them sick because their systems could no longer process rich food. The psychological damage of this disparity went beyond hunger. It attacked the fundamental narrative that had sustained Japanese soldiers through training and combat, the narrative that told them they were superior, that their cause was just, that their sacrifice had meaning. To starve while the enemy ate chocolate was to confront the possibility that everything they had been told was a lie. American intelligence officers recognized this and attempted, with limited success, to exploit it through psychological warfare operations. Leaflets were dropped over Japanese positions, showing photographs of abundant American supplies, with text promising good treatment and adequate food for prisoners. Loudspeakers broadcast messages describing the meals waiting for those who surrendered. These efforts had some effect, particularly late in the war as Japanese resistance became increasingly hopeless. But they ran up against cultural barriers that American psychological warfare specialists often failed to understand. The shame of surrender, the conviction that capture meant dishonor that could never be erased. The genuine belief that Americans tortured and killed prisoners these beliefs kept most. Japanese soldiers fighting, even when continued resistance was clearly futile. But the messages about food struck a deep chord. And many prisoners interrogated after the war admitted that the promises of adequate rations had been a factor in their decision to surrender, competing with shame and fear in their final calculations. The testimony of these prisoners provides the most direct window into the psychological impact of the ration disparity. Lieutenant Masao Watanabe, captured on Saipan in July 1944, told his interrogators, "We knew we were beaten when we saw how you fed your soldiers. Not because of the amount, though, that was extraordinary, because it showed that your country could fight this war without straining, that you had resources left over after equipping your military. Our civilians at home were going hungry so the military could be supplied, and even then we barely had enough. Your civilians were comfortable, and your military had luxuries. The war was over before it started. We just didn't know it yet." Another prisoner, a sergeant from the garrison on Tinian, described the moment he understood the scope of American capacity. "After you landed, I found a dump of discarded rations. Not captured, not carefully saved, just thrown away because they were outdated or you had received better supplies. Thrown away. There was more food in that garbage than my unit had received in a month. I knew then that we could never win." The chocolate, specifically, appears again and again in these testimonies. Invested with symbolic power beyond its physical substance, it was sweet and increasingly rare taste in the Japanese military experience. It was dense with calories, providing energy in a compact form. But more than these practical attributes, it represented the optional, the unnecessary, the beyond survival. Civilizations fighting for their existence do not produce chocolate for their soldiers. Civilizations fighting from positions of strength and surplus do. Every chocolate bar in a ration was thus a small brown declaration of American confidence, an edible assertion that the United States could afford to care about whether its soldiers enjoyed what they ate. Japanese veterans interviewed decades after the war would describe the taste of captured American chocolate with a precision that suggested the memory had been burnished by constant recollection. "It was sweeter than Japanese chocolate before the war," one veteran remembered. "It melted on your tongue. I made it last as long as I could, holding pieces in my mouth until they dissolved completely. I knew I would probably never taste chocolate again. The cigarettes functioned as both comfort and currency in the brutal economies that developed in isolated garrisons. A pack of American cigarettes could be traded for favors, for slightly better positions in the defense line, for information, for promises of mutual assistance. They were hoarded, rationed with desperate care, shared in moments of connection that transcended rank and military discipline. The American tobacco was different from Japanese cigarettes, stronger, harsher in some ways, but fresher. Properly preserved in packaging that kept out the jungle moisture that ruined Japanese tobacco within days. To smoke an American cigarette was to temporarily escape one's circumstances, to participate in a small ritual that connected the smoker to peacetime normalcy. Japanese soldiers would photograph themselves with captured American cigarettes or write home about them, trying to convey to families who could never understand what it meant to have access, however briefly, to this small luxury, and the coffee remained the most potent symbol of all. Because it represented not just abundance, but innovation applied to the smallest details of military life. The instant coffee issued to American troops was a marvel of food science, a product that required sophisticated industrial chemistry to produce. It dissolved completely in water, required no brewing equipment, produced a consistent result every time. Two Japanese soldiers accustomed to complexity and ritual, even in the smallest acts, the precise way to fold a uniform, the correct method to clean a rifle, the proper etiquette for addressing superiors. This American casualness about what should have been complex was both attractive and threatening. It suggested a society that valued efficiency and results over tradition and form, that would innovate without respect for how things had always been done. The coffee was democratic in a way that Japanese military culture was not. Every American soldier got the same coffee, prepared the same way, with the same added sugar and cream. There was no special allocation for officers, no hierarchy of quality based on rank. This egalitarianism, visible in something as small as instant coffee, reflected fundamental differences in how the two societies conceived of military service and the relationship between individual and state. The transformation in consciousness among Japanese soldiers who survived long enough to fully comprehend what they faced was neither uniform nor complete, but it was profound and permanent. Some men clung to the old beliefs with desperate intensity, interpreting every setback as a temporary reversal that would be overcome through greater sacrifice and more absolute dedication to the emperor. Others experienced a slow erosion of certainty, a gradual recognition that the material advantages they had been taught to dismiss as moral weakness were, in fact, expressions of a different kind of strength: organizational strength, industrial strength, the strength of a society that could mobilize total war without requiring total suffering from its citizens. Still others underwent more sudden conversions, moments of clarity when the accumulated weight of evidence finally exceeded the capacity of ideology to explain it away. Corporal Yamamoto, who began this story in a captured foxhole on Guadalcanal, survived that campaign by the narrowest of margins. He was part of the evacuation in February 1943. One of the 11,000 emaciated survivors pulled off the island in a desperate night operation that left behind 10 times that many dead from combat, disease, and starvation. He weighed 42 kilograms when he reached the hospital ship, down from his pre-combat weight of 63. He could barely walk. His body was covered in tropical ulcers, and he suffered from chronic dysentery that would trouble him for the rest of his life. But he was alive, and in his pack, carefully preserved through everything, was a wrapper from that first chocolate bar he had eaten in the American foxhole during his recovery period on Rabaul. Waiting for his body to regain enough strength for him to return to duty, Yamamoto spent long hours trying to make sense of what he had experienced. The official explanation that Guadalcanal had been a strategic withdrawal, that Japanese forces had accomplished their objectives and repositioned according to plan, was so obviously false that it insulted the intelligence of anyone who had actually fought there. They had been beaten, comprehensively and brutally, by an enemy that had superior firepower, superior supply, and contrary to all predictions, a superior morale. The Americans had not broken when cut off from supplies because they were never cut off. Their supply lines functioned with a reliability that seemed almost supernatural to men who would watch their own logistics system collapse entirely. They had not fled from Japanese attacks. They had held their ground and counterattacked with a coordination that suggested excellent communications and clear command structures. And throughout the entire campaign, they had eaten chocolate and smoked cigarettes and drunk coffee, maintaining a connection to civilian comfort that Japanese soldiers had been told would make them weak, but which had evidently made them stronger. Yamamoto was sent to New Guinea, then to the Philippines, following the slow retreat westward as American forces advanced with inexorable momentum. At each position, the pattern repeated: initial confidence, stubborn resistance, gradual attrition, eventual withdrawal, or annihilation. And at each position, whenever Japanese forces managed to capture American supplies, the same jarring encounter with abundance. The same cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality. In New Guinea, Yamamoto's unit overran a forward aid station and found it stocked with morphine, bandages, antiseptic, surgical equipment, and somehow, more shocking, toothbrushes, soap, and toilet paper. The Americans cared for their soldiers' dental hygiene in combat zones. They provided soap even when water was scarce. They included toilet paper in supply manifests as a matter of course, rather than requiring soldiers to improvise with leaves and bark. These small considerations, multiplied across millions of soldiers and thousands of miles of supply line, represented a level of logistical sophistication and economic power that Yamamoto now understood was simply insurmountable. By the time he reached the Philippines in late 1944, Yamamoto's transformation was complete. He still fought, still obeyed orders, still did his duty as he understood it, but he no longer believed in victory. He knew, with the certainty of accumulated evidence, that Japan would lose this war because it had entered a contest it could never win. It's not a contest of courage or willpower or spiritual strength, but a contest of industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. The chocolate bars and cigarettes and instant coffee were not mere luxuries. They were symptoms of a healthy economic organism, society that could produce vast surpluses and deploy them across the globe without strain. Japan, by contrast, was consuming itself from within, demanding greater sacrifices from its citizens while producing less, asking its soldiers to die for a cause that had already been lost in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of California. When American forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, Yamamoto was part of the desperate defense that tried and failed to throw them back into the sea. He fought in the hills, retreating slowly through terrain that offered every advantage to the defender and no advantage at all against an enemy that could call down artillery at will and resupply by air. By December, his unit had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Men scattered into the jungle to continue resistance as partisans or simply to survive as long as possible. Yamamoto, wounded in the leg and unable to keep up with the remnants of his squad, made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him 2 years earlier. He surrendered. He walked into an American patrol base with his hands raised, expecting to be shot. Almost hoping for it, because at least that would be quick and resolve the shame of capture. Instead, he was disarmed, searched, given medical treatment for his wound, and fed a meal from a 10-in-1 ration that contained more food than he had eaten in the previous week. There was coffee, real coffee made hot in a field kitchen, with sugar and condensed milk. There were cigarettes offered casually by American guards who seemed more bored than hostile. And there was chocolate. A Hershey's bar handed to him by a medic with a smile and a few words of English that Yamamoto didn't understand, but whose intent was clear enough. He sat in that prisoner holding area, eating American chocolate, and felt the last remnants of his certainty dissolve. Everything he had been taught about the enemy had been wrong. They were not cruel. They had treated his wound before interrogating him. They were not weak. They had beaten his army with casual efficiency. They were not decadent. Their discipline was different from Japanese discipline, but no less effective. And they were not facing hardship to win this war. They were fighting from abundance, from surplus, from reserves so deep that they gave their prisoners the same rations their own soldiers ate. The chocolate tasted the same as it had in that foxhole on Guadalcanal 2 years and an eternity ago. But Yamamoto tasted it differently now, without anger or envy, with something closer to resignation or acceptance. This was what defeat tasted like. Sweet, rich, American. The taste of the future, the broader transformation in Japanese. Military consciousness was not uniform across all forces or all time periods, but the pattern Yamamoto experienced was repeated thousands of times throughout the Pacific War. As the conflict progressed and Japanese forces were increasingly isolated and starved, the encounters with American abundance became more psychologically devastating. Soldiers who might have dismissed a single encounter with well-supplied Americans as an anomaly could not dismiss the consistent pattern across every theater, every island, every battle. The evidence accumulated beyond the point where ideology could explain it away. The Americans were not supposed to be able to sustain operations across such vast distances. They were not supposed to maintain supply lines that functioned with mechanical precision. They were not supposed to care about whether their soldiers had chocolate. But they did all of these things. And they did them so well that Japanese soldiers watching from positions of desperate hunger could not avoid the conclusion that they were fighting an enemy whose power derived not from moral superiority, but from material abundance so vast that it might as well be infinite. This recognition did not necessarily translate into surrender or even reduced combat effectiveness in the short term. Japanese soldiers continued to fight with extraordinary tenacity, long after rational calculation suggested that further resistance was pointless. The cultural barriers to surrender remained powerful, and many men chose death over the shame of capture. Regardless of what they had come to understand about the broader trajectory of the war, but the psychological impact was real and measurable. Morale reports from Japanese units, when such reports continued to be filed, documented declining confidence in victory, increasing questions about the strategic wisdom of high command, and growing resentment toward officers who continued to preach spiritual superiority. While evidence of material inferiority was overwhelming, the rations, the chocolate and cigarettes and coffee, the casual abundance of the American supply system became focal points for these doubts. Concrete evidence that could not be argued away or reinterpreted through ideological frameworks,